"Touch me and you'll know why I'm still alive," confessed the Apache widow to the rancher. The sun had barely begun its climb above the horizon when the small frontier town started to stir. Wooden houses lined the dusty streets, their porches creaking under the weight of a new day. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint smell of bread baking and coffee brewing. Children laughed in the distance, chasing each other across the open fields, their small boots kicking up tiny clouds of dust. Yet at the edge of town, where the plains stretched wide and wild, there was a house that remained quiet, untouched by the morning clamor. It was here, in that solitary dwelling, that the widow lived. Her house was modest, built from weathered logs, with a roof patched in places and windows that reflected the sunlight like worn glass mirrors. She lived alone, not by choice, but by the inevitability of her past. Those who had tried to approach her often found their curiosity met with a wall of silence or a polite nod, nothing more. She was known as the Apache widow, a woman who carried the weight of history in her eyes, a history that the townspeople could only guess at. The rancher first noticed her on a chilly morning when he was tending to his own land. He was a practical man, one who measured his days in chores completed and crops harvested, but something about her drew his attention. Perhaps it was the way she moved, deliberate and quiet, as if every step mattered. Or perhaps it was the way she carried herself, not with arrogance but with a quiet dignity that could not be ignored. He had seen many people in his life, and most of them left traces of themselves that faded quickly. Not her. She left a mark even in the briefest glance. Life in the frontier was harsh. People came and went, seeking fortune, peace, or simply a place to survive. The widow had seen more of life than most, though few could imagine the depth of her experience. She had faced loss so profound that even the hardiest townspeople would shiver at the thought. And yet here she was, standing firm, living each day with the resilience of someone who had learned to endure more than most could imagine. The rancher often wondered about her, about the stories she carried but did not tell, and he found himself drawn into a silent curiosity he could not explain. One morning, a simple event brought them together. The widow's horse had broken loose from its tether and wandered into the rancher's field. The animal was gentle but frightened, moving cautiously among the crops. The rancher approached slowly, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. The widow arrived moments later, her boots crunching against the dry earth, and together they managed to calm the horse. She spoke little, but her voice carried a calm authority, the kind that demanded respect without asking for it. He noticed how her eyes, dark and steady, seemed to see far beyond the present moment, into memories and experiences that shaped every movement she made. From that day, a fragile connection began. The rancher respected her space, visiting only when necessary and offering help in quiet ways. He would bring supplies occasionally or fix a fence that had fallen in the wind, never imposing, never intrusive. The widow, in turn, allowed these small gestures, not because she trusted easily, but because she recognized a sincerity that was rare in the world. It was a beginning built on understanding, patience, and the unspoken recognition that both had faced challenges life could not erase. Evenings in the frontier had a way of softening the hardest hearts. As the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, the air would cool, carrying the scent of wild grass and distant pine. The widow would sit on her porch, her hands resting on her knees, watching the horizon with eyes that seemed to look through time itself. The rancher would sometimes stop by, standing a respectful distance away, observing her silently. Words were not always necessary. In their shared silence, there was a dialogue of respect, a recognition of each other's endurance. The townspeople often whispered about her past. Some said she had survived a raid that claimed her family. Others believed she had escaped a life far worse than any of them could imagine. But these were only rumors, shadows of reality, and the widow let them pass without correction. She had learned long ago that people sought stories to satisfy curiosity, not to understand truth. The truth of her life was not for them. It was a private collection of memories, lessons, and survival that no one could take away, and no one could judge. There were moments when the widow's solitude was almost tangible. The wind would rise across the plains, rattling the windows and carrying whispers from the hills. She would sometimes speak to herself then, quietly, as if rehearsing memories or speaking to those lost. The rancher noticed these moments only once or twice when passing by, and though he respected her privacy, he could not help but feel a tug of empathy. He understood in a way that grief and endurance often walk together, each step a careful negotiation between past and present. Yet the widow was not merely a figure of sorrow. She was resourceful, strong, and remarkably skilled. Her garden thrived where others failed, fed by her knowledge of the land and her patience. Her home, though simple, was neat and orderly, evidence of a meticulous nature honed by necessity. Every action was deliberate, every choice purposeful. The rancher observed this silently, learning about her without words, understanding that her strength was quiet but formidable. In a world that demanded survival above all else, she had not only survived, she had mastered it. Their connection, though slow, began to deepen. The rancher found himself thinking of her often, wondering about the stories behind her eyes, the experiences that shaped her presence. He began leaving small gifts at her doorstep, freshly baked bread, a jar of honey from his bees, a bundle of herbs from his garden. She accepted them without fanfare, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering a small smile. It was a silent acknowledgement, a bridge between two people who had learned to respect the spaces between them while gradually leaning closer. One evening, as the sky darkened and stars began to pierce the vast expanse above, the widow invited the rancher to sit near her porch fire. It was the first time she had spoken more than a few words to him in a casual, uninterrupted moment. They spoke of the land, the weather, the cycles of planting and harvest. They avoided personal history, yet each word carried an unspoken recognition of shared understanding, of lives shaped by hardship, endurance, and resilience. By the time the fire burned low, the rancher felt a quiet admiration, not just for her survival, but for her presence, her calm strength, and the way she existed fully in a world that had been cruel. The frontier was a place of extremes, harsh winters, blistering summers, and long stretches of loneliness. Yet in the quiet, tentative connection between the widow and the rancher, there was a sense of possibility. Not romance, not rescue, but something subtler. The knowledge that even in isolation, two people could recognize each other, understand each other, and find a fragile companionship in shared respect. It was the beginning of a story neither expected, but both silently hoped could exist. The widow, for her part, continued to live with dignity and quiet vigilance. She never invited, never sought attention, yet she allowed herself small openings, gestures of trust. The rancher, in turn, never pressed, never demanded, but simply observed, learned, and respected. And in that slow, careful dance of recognition and patience, the story of the Apache widow began, not with grand events, but with small, meaningful connections, the kind that survive longer than fire or flood, the kind that endure because they are earned. By the end of that first month of quiet interaction, the rancher knew two things clearly. She was a survivor, and she was someone who had been through more than most could bear. He could see the resilience in her posture, the intelligence in her eyes, and the strength in her quiet movements. He did not understand all of it, nor did he need to. It was enough to acknowledge it, to honor it, and to let her presence teach him patience and respect in ways he had never learned before. And so, the days continued, simple, ordinary, yet quietly profound. In the mornings, the widow worked her land and cared for her home. The rancher tended his animals, fixed his fences, and left small tokens at her door. In the evenings, sometimes they shared quiet moments on her porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, listening to the wind, and understanding each other without words. Life, harsh and unpredictable as it was in the frontier, carried within it a thread of connection, and both of them held on to it, fragile but unbroken. The days moved slowly on the frontier, each one marked by sun and wind, by work and quiet moments. The rancher had begun to feel a deeper curiosity about the widow, a curiosity that was no longer just about the present. He wanted to understand her past, not to pry or judge, but to understand the strength that carried her through life. Though he never asked directly, he noticed the small ways her past touched the present, the careful way she handled her belongings, the sudden stillness when the wind carried certain scents, the faraway look in her eyes at unexpected moments. Each gesture told a story, and he was learning to read them patiently. The widow's life had been shaped by circumstances that most people could barely imagine. Before she arrived in this quiet town, she had lived in places that had been taken from her, where danger was constant, and every day required careful planning to survive. She had known hunger, fear, and loss in ways that left marks not visible to the eye but deeply present in the soul. People often spoke of survival as if it were simple, but for her, it had been both a test and a burden, a daily struggle that demanded both courage and cunning. She had learned to move quietly, to speak when necessary, and to trust only when there was reason to do so. Her family had been everything to her, and losing them had changed the course of her life forever. She had been young, barely more than a teenager, when the raids came. The memories were sharp and painful. The sounds of shouting, the cries of loved ones, the panic of fleeing through forests and mountains with nothing but what she could carry. She remembered the fear that had threatened to paralyze her, the moments when she had thought she might not survive. But somehow she had. Somehow she had found ways to navigate a world that seemed determined to destroy her. Each scar, each memory, was a testament to her resilience. Some were visible, faint lines across her hands, small reminders of injuries she had healed herself. Others were invisible, etched into her mind and heart, moments she would never forget. She did not speak of these things lightly, and the rancher knew better than to push her. He had learned that listening without asking was sometimes the greatest kindness. He had seen the toll that life could take, and he understood that some wounds were not meant to be shared with everyone. Despite the hardships, the widow had found ways to keep herself alive and moving forward. She had learned the ways of the land, how to grow food even in difficult soil, how to care for animals, and how to survive the harsh winters and scorching summers. Every skill she had acquired was born from necessity, yet it gave her a quiet confidence. She carried herself with a calm that only someone who had endured true hardship could possess. The rancher began to realize that her strength was not just physical, it was mental, emotional, and spiritual. There were moments when the past seemed to reach out to her, moments when a sound, a smell, or even the angle of the sun reminded her of what she had lost. She would pause, her hands frozen mid-task, her eyes distant. The rancher noticed these pauses and never interrupted them. He understood, without needing to be told, that these were the moments she reconciled with memory, moments when survival meant remembering what had been endured. Over time, these small gestures of respect built a silent trust between them. The widow also carried lessons from her past that shaped the way she interacted with the world. She had learned the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment, of choosing allies carefully. She had learned that strength was not always in confrontation, but in endurance, in the quiet refusal to be broken. She had learned to read people, to understand intentions without needing to hear them spoken. These lessons had saved her life more than once, and they continued to guide her every action. One afternoon, the rancher came across her in the garden, carefully tending to her plants. He watched as she worked with meticulous attention, her fingers moving deftly among the soil and roots. For a moment, she looked up and smiled, a small, fleeting expression that carried warmth and acknowledgement. It was in moments like this that the rancher began to sense the depth of her past, not in stories or words, but in the way she lived her life, in the care and thought she put into even the smallest tasks. The frontier was not kind to those who were unprepared, yet the widow had not only survived but had learned to thrive in her own way. She had faced the harshest realities and emerged with a sense of self that was unshakable. The rancher began to see her not just as a figure of curiosity or mystery, but as a person who embodied the very qualities he respected most: resilience, intelligence, and quiet courage. As their acquaintance grew, the widow began to share small parts of her story, not the tragedies themselves, but the lessons learned and the wisdom gained. She spoke of the importance of observation, of understanding the land, of listening before acting. She shared practical knowledge: how to care for animals, how to store food for winter, how to move quietly without attracting danger. These teachings were practical, yes, but also a reflection of her past, a testament to the experiences that had shaped her. There was one evening, as the sky turned a deep orange and the first stars began to appear, when the widow spoke in a way that felt different from before. They were sitting by a small fire, the warmth cutting through the cool air, and she began to recount a moment from her youth. She did not describe the tragedy, only the lesson: how she had learned to rely on her own instincts, how she had discovered that even in fear there could be clarity. The rancher listened silently, understanding that these words were more than stories. They were the framework of her life, the reasoning behind every action she had taken since. Through these stories, the rancher began to understand why the widow carried herself the way she did. He saw that her solitude was not bitterness but protection, a carefully built wall that kept her safe from harm while allowing her to live fully. He began to realize that survival was not just about enduring the past, but about understanding it, learning from it, and using it to navigate the present. The widow's life was a series of carefully measured steps, each one informed by experience and reflection. It was not an easy life, and the widow did not pretend it was. There were still days when memories weighed heavily, when the loneliness of the frontier pressed in. Yet she faced each day with determination, finding small joys where she could. The taste of fresh bread, the sight of a new sprout in her garden, the quiet companionship of animals who trusted her. These simple moments were her victories, reminders that life continued even after great loss. The rancher, watching her navigate her daily life, came to admire her more with each passing day. He understood that her strength was not something to be challenged or tested, but something to be respected. He began to reflect on his own life, realizing that he had taken comfort and safety for granted, while she had built hers from hardship and resilience. In this recognition, he found not pity but genuine admiration. She had survived the impossible, and she continued to thrive in ways that inspired him. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky with colors that seemed almost unreal, the widow and the rancher shared a quiet moment. Words were unnecessary. Their mutual understanding spoke volumes. They had both experienced life in ways that demanded endurance, yet they had found in each other a silent acknowledgement of what that endurance meant. It was a rare connection, fragile but profound, built on respect, observation, and unspoken trust. The widow's past remained largely unspoken, yet its presence was undeniable. It informed her actions, guided her decisions, and shaped her worldview. The rancher knew that he would never fully understand it, nor did he need to. What mattered was the recognition of her strength, the acknowledgement of the life she had survived, and the quiet admiration that had grown between them. And so, life continued on the edge of the land. The widow tended to her home and garden, moved with careful purpose, and carried the weight of her past with dignity. The rancher observed, learned, and respected, deepening his understanding of what it meant to survive, to endure, and to continue living with courage. Their connection, slow and deliberate, became a steady presence in both of their lives, a testament to resilience, patience, and the quiet power of shared respect. In this part of the frontier, where the world was harsh and unpredictable, a story was unfolding, not one of dramatic heroics, but of survival, understanding, and the subtle ways human connection could grow even in the most difficult circumstances. The widow had survived more than most could bear, and in doing so, she taught the rancher the most important lesson of all, that true strength was not loud or boastful, but quiet, steady, and enduring. White heavy checkmark word count, ~1 500 words. The widow's garden flourished, a testament to her patience and knowledge of the land, and the rancher often admired the care she took with every plant, every row, every small detail. Their connection had deepened over time, but it was a slow and careful process, like water carving a riverbed through rock. Both understood that trust could not be rushed, and they respected each other's pace. The widow's silence was a shield, and the rancher had long ago learned not to push. He did not ask intrusive questions, but he noticed everything: the way her hands moved as she worked, the slight hesitation in her steps when approaching the edge of her land, the way her eyes softened when she looked at animals or the distant horizon. Each observation gave him insight into her life, and each insight deepened his respect. He had grown to understand that her strength was both visible and invisible, tangible and quietly present in the way she faced each day. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, the rancher came across her repairing a fence along the edge of her property. The wind had torn several boards loose, and she worked with steady hands, fitting each piece carefully, measuring with her eyes before touching the wood. He offered to help, but she shook her head with a faint smile. "I have it," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. It was not a refusal born of pride, but of self-reliance, a lesson learned from years of needing to depend on herself. He stepped back, watching, understanding that some tasks were as much about preserving dignity as completing work. Their evenings became moments of quiet companionship. They would sit on her porch as the sky changed color, sharing silence more than words. Sometimes the widow spoke of simple things: the weather, the crops, the patterns of the land. Sometimes she told small stories of her past, not the tragedies themselves, but the lessons she had learned. She spoke of surviving hunger by observing nature, of escaping danger by listening to the land, and of finding small joys even when the world seemed determined to take everything away. Each story, while brief, revealed a depth of experience that left the rancher both humbled and inspired. There were nights, however, when the past pressed against her, and he could see it in her expression. She would pause mid-action, staring into the darkness, her hands trembling slightly, her breath catching. He never asked what haunted her in those moments. He knew enough to understand that some memories were private, and that the act of living fully was sometimes its own confrontation with the past. In these moments, he would simply remain nearby, a silent presence that offered reassurance without words. The widow had learned that true companionship did not demand explanations, only patience and understanding. One evening, a sudden storm swept across the plains. Lightning flashed, illuminating the land, and thunder rolled like distant drums. The widow moved swiftly, securing her animals and checking her home. The rancher came to help, bringing tools and offering hands where needed. She accepted the help, not out of necessity alone, but because it was a shared effort, a recognition that survival sometimes required cooperation. As they worked together through the storm, a quiet bond grew stronger, formed not from words but from shared action. They learned that strength could be expressed through collaboration, and trust through the simple act of being present. The widow's past had taught her to be cautious, and she carried that caution like a shield. She had learned that openness could be dangerous, that vulnerability could be exploited. Yet with the rancher, she found a rare sense of safety. He did not rush her, did not demand explanations or gestures of trust. He simply observed, respected, and offered what help he could without expectation. Over time, this steady presence created a space where she could begin to let the walls around her heart soften, not fully, but enough to allow moments of connection to exist. There were evenings when she would share glimpses of her past, carefully chosen fragments that revealed strength rather than pain. She spoke of traveling through harsh lands, of finding food and shelter where none seemed possible, and of enduring long nights filled with fear and uncertainty. These stories were told with quiet matter-of-factness, as if the challenges were simply parts of life to be managed. The rancher listened, never interrupting, absorbing the lessons embedded in her experiences. He realized that her survival was not about luck. It was about intelligence, courage, and a refusal to surrender to despair. Gradually, the widow began to reveal more of her emotional resilience. She spoke of grief, of the moments when loneliness threatened to overwhelm her, and of the strategies she had learned to cope. She did not portray herself as a victim, but as someone who had faced impossible odds and emerged alive. She explained how she had learned to find small moments of joy, how she had cultivated routines that grounded her, and how she had relied on her own inner strength to navigate a world that often seemed indifferent. The rancher found these insights both humbling and enlightening, realizing that her quiet demeanor concealed a formidable spirit. Their conversations also touched on hope, though cautiously. The widow did not speak of future plans in grand terms, but she acknowledged the possibility of change, of companionship, and of shared life. She recognized the rancher's presence as steady, a contrast to the uncertainty that had defined much of her existence. In this subtle acknowledgement, there was an unspoken agreement that survival was not just about enduring the past, but about cautiously opening oneself to the present. Trust, she had learned, was earned through consistency and understanding. The rancher, too, began to reflect on his own life through their interactions. He recognized that he had lived with a sense of security that she had never known, and he felt a growing admiration for the way she approached life with dignity and determination. He realized that the strength she displayed was not easily achieved. It was a product of years of facing fear, loss, and hardship, and choosing to continue anyway. Her life, he saw, was a lesson in endurance, patience, and the quiet power of resilience. There were moments when the widow allowed herself small acts of trust that spoke louder than words. She would let him help with heavy tasks, share meals in the evening, or simply sit together in silence. These moments were carefully measured, deliberate, and meaningful. Each one was a step forward, a subtle opening of her heart, and the rancher approached them with the respect they deserved. He understood that true connection was not built in haste, but in patience, observation, and consistent care. One late afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the plains, the widow shared a story that hinted at her greatest lesson in survival. She spoke of a time when she had been entirely alone, with no food, no shelter, and no certainty of safety. She described the strategy she had used, how she had observed the land, conserved her energy, and relied on her instincts. The story was not told as a tale of fear, but as a demonstration of resourcefulness, intelligence, and inner strength. The rancher listened closely, feeling both awe and respect, understanding that the lessons she carried were not merely practical but deeply personal, shaping the way she approached every day. Over time, the widow's trust in the rancher deepened, though it remained guarded. She began to share more personal reflections, thoughts about the past, and the values that guided her life. She spoke of loyalty, of courage, and of the importance of understanding both the land and people. Each revelation, small as it might seem, strengthened their connection. The rancher realized that these moments were significant, and he treated them with care, responding with empathy, patience, and a quiet understanding that honored her experiences. The frontier continued its relentless rhythm, yet amidst the daily chores and challenges, a quiet story of connection unfolded. It was not marked by dramatic events or sudden revelations, but by consistent presence, mutual respect, and the subtle growth of trust. The widow and the rancher discovered that even in a world shaped by hardship and uncertainty, human connection could emerge, not through grand gestures, but through the careful attention, patience, and understanding that allowed both to feel seen and respected. By the end of this period, the widow had begun to reveal herself in small, meaningful ways. She shared her knowledge, her insights, and the careful wisdom gained from years of survival. The rancher, in turn, had become a steady presence, offering help without demand, listening without judgment, and respecting the boundaries she had carefully constructed. Their bond, though quiet and slow to develop, was strong and rooted in understanding. The widow had survived a life filled with loss and challenge, and in doing so, she had developed a remarkable capacity for observation, patience, and quiet strength. The rancher recognized that these qualities were rare and valuable, and he honored them with his own actions. Together, they continued to navigate the demands of life on the frontier, building a connection that was unspoken but powerful, founded on mutual respect and the recognition of each other's experiences. And so, the story continued, subtle, quiet, and deeply human. The widow, shaped by her past, continued to live with dignity and careful attention, while the rancher learned the meaning of endurance, trust, and the slow cultivation of connection. In the vast and often harsh landscape, they found in each other a source of understanding and stability, a testament to the enduring power of human resilience and the quiet strength that comes from surviving, learning, and cautiously opening one's heart. The days were long, stretching under the bright sun and over the wide, open plains, but the evenings brought a quiet intimacy that the widow and the rancher had begun to share. The air cooled, carrying the scent of wild grass and the faint aroma of the nearby river. It was during these hours that the widow allowed herself to speak more openly, revealing parts of her life that had been hidden beneath years of silence. The rancher listened carefully, understanding that this was not casual conversation, but a deliberate opening of her heart. She began by speaking of survival, not in terms of fear or tragedy, but in terms of strength and purpose. "There are moments," she said one evening, her voice calm but firm, "when you realize that living is not a choice but a responsibility. You survive not for yourself, but because someone or something needs you to continue. You become the keeper of your own life, and that is both heavy and empowering." The rancher watched her closely, recognizing the weight of her words. They were not complaints, they were truths, carefully considered and hard-earned. The widow spoke of her past with careful selectivity. She did not dwell on the pain, but she allowed him glimpses into the challenges that had shaped her. She described nights spent alone in forests, relying only on her instincts to find shelter and food. She spoke of crossing rivers in flood, scaling cliffs to escape danger, and the long stretches of uncertainty when she did not know whether she would survive until morning. Each story was recounted with a matter-of-fact tone, yet beneath her calm voice was the unspoken truth. She had endured all of it and emerged stronger, not broken. Through her words, the rancher began to understand the depth of her resilience. Her survival was not a product of luck or chance. It was the result of intelligence, careful observation, and unwavering determination. Every action she took, from tending her garden to repairing her home, carried the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate life's dangers with caution and skill. The rancher felt a growing respect for her, not pity, not curiosity, but genuine admiration for the way she had faced the impossible and refused to be defeated. It was during these conversations that the widow first shared her feelings about trust. She explained that it was something she had learned to guard fiercely. Trust is earned slowly, she said one evening as the fire crackled between them. "I have learned that people can take advantage of weakness. I have been tested in ways you cannot imagine. So I protect what is mine, the heart, the mind, the sense of self carefully. And yet trust is also necessary. Without it, life becomes loneliness. Without it, survival is hollow." The rancher nodded quietly, understanding that her cautious nature was not coldness, but a protective shield forged from experience. As their connection deepened, the widow began to share the ways in which she had found meaning in life despite loss. She spoke of the land, the animals, and the small acts of care that sustained her. She described the joy she felt in cultivating her garden, in observing the cycles of nature, and in creating a home that reflected her values and diligence. These details, seemingly simple, revealed a woman of depth and intention, someone who had refused to allow her past to define her entirely, choosing instead to live fully in the present. There were also moments of reflection, where the widow spoke of fear and sorrow. She did not seek sympathy, but she acknowledged that life had tested her in ways that had left lasting impressions. "I have felt despair," she said quietly one night, "when the world seemed too cruel, when every step forward felt impossible. But even in despair, I found ways to continue. Sometimes survival means holding on, even when hope seems faint. Sometimes it means moving forward without knowing the destination." The rancher listened, feeling the weight of her words and the quiet strength that underpinned them. It was in this context that she made her first true confession to him, not of desire but of resilience. "Touch me," she said one evening, her voice steady and calm, "and you will understand why I am still alive. It is not a question of intimacy. It is a question of understanding. Every scar, every mark, every line carries a story of survival. They are the reasons I am here. They are proof that I have endured, that I have chosen to live when life offered nothing but hardship." The rancher absorbed her words carefully, recognizing the courage it took to share such a truth. Her body, her presence, and her history were intertwined, and she allowed him a glimpse into the depth of her life. The rancher came to understand that her confession was not an invitation in the conventional sense. It was a revelation, a statement of fact, a declaration of the strength she carried within herself. She was not seeking comfort or validation. She was offering insight into the life she had lived and the power she had discovered in survival. Each scar was a lesson, each mark a testament to endurance, and she wanted him to see that strength clearly, without misunderstanding or judgment. As the days passed, the widow and the rancher began to work together in new ways. He assisted her with heavier tasks, not as a savior but as a partner. She allowed him to help, recognizing the value of collaboration and the subtle strength in shared effort. They repaired fences, tended the garden, and prepared for the coming seasons together, each action reinforcing their growing bond. These activities were not merely practical. They became a language of trust and mutual respect, a way to communicate without words the understanding they had built over time. The widow also spoke of the lessons she had learned from hardship. She shared how she had cultivated patience, how she had learned to observe before acting, and how she had developed the ability to read people and situations with precision. These lessons were invaluable, not just for survival but for life itself. The rancher listened, absorbing her wisdom, realizing that the experiences that had shaped her were rare and profound. He saw that her strength was not loud or boastful, but quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in the trials she had faced. There were moments when her past seemed to loom, subtle but powerful. A sound, a smell, or even the shifting light would bring a shadow across her face, a reminder of the life she had endured. The rancher never asked what haunted her in those moments. He knew that some memories were private, and that acknowledging them without pressing was the greatest respect he could offer. In these quiet recognitions, their connection deepened further, built on understanding rather than curiosity, empathy rather than intrusion. Even in her solitude, the widow found a sense of purpose. She had discovered that life, even after loss, could be meaningful. She tended her animals with care, cultivated her land with patience, and preserved a home that reflected her values and resilience. These acts were daily affirmations of her strength, subtle reminders that she was alive not merely by chance, but by deliberate choice. The rancher witnessed this, learning that true courage often manifests in quiet, consistent actions rather than dramatic displays. One evening, after a long day of work in the fields, they sat together by the fire. The widow reflected on the lessons of survival, the importance of self-reliance, and the necessity of trust. She shared how she had navigated life's challenges by combining intelligence with patience, resilience with observation, and caution with calculated risk. Each word carried weight, and the rancher realized that her strength was not accidental. It was a deliberate, conscious choice that defined every aspect of her being. Their conversations also touched on hope, subtly but powerfully. The widow did not speak of grand dreams or future plans, but she acknowledged the possibility of life beyond mere survival. She recognized that connection, understanding, and trust were forms of hope in themselves, small but significant. In this acknowledgement, the rancher saw not vulnerability, but a quiet courage that allowed her to engage with the world while protecting herself from harm. By the end of this period, the widow's openness had grown. She had revealed truths about her past, her strategies for survival, and the lessons she had learned. She had made her first profound confession, allowing the rancher to see the depth of her life and the reasons she continued to live with such strength. In return, he had offered consistent presence, respect, and understanding, proving that trust could be nurtured patiently over time. In the vast, open landscape of the frontier, their bond became a quiet but powerful force. It was not built on words alone, nor on dramatic events, but on shared experiences, mutual respect, and the subtle revelation of truths that required courage to speak. The widow had shown him that survival was not merely physical, it was emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. And the rancher, in turn, had demonstrated that recognition, patience, and respect were essential to understanding the lives of others. Through these days and nights, a story of human resilience and connection unfolded. The widow's past, though painful, became a source of wisdom and strength. Her presence, carefully measured and deliberate, taught the rancher lessons about trust, endurance, and the quiet power of survival. And in this mutual recognition, they discovered that even in a world shaped by hardship, two people could find understanding, respect, and a shared sense of strength. The days grew warmer, the sun brighter, and the plains stretched endlessly under a sky so wide it seemed to carry every possibility. Life on the frontier continued its rhythm, harsh yet beautiful, but for the widow and the rancher, something subtle yet profound had shifted. Their connection, built slowly over months of observation, patience, and shared effort, had grown into a quiet, unspoken understanding. It was a bond that did not need dramatic gestures or grand declarations. It thrived in respect, trust, and the recognition of strength in one another. The widow moved through her days with a calm that had become familiar to the rancher. She tended her garden carefully, repaired fences, cared for her animals, and prepared her home for the changing seasons. Each action carried the weight of experience, yet she moved with a grace that spoke of resilience and self-reliance. The rancher often watched her, sometimes offering help, sometimes merely observing, always with a deep respect for the life she had built and the strength she carried within herself. One afternoon, a small event reminded them both of the fragility and the value of life. A young colt had wandered too close to the edge of a cliff, and the widow moved quickly, guiding it back to safety. The rancher arrived at the same moment, helping steady the frightened animal. Together, they led it back to the safety of the corral. It was a simple act, yet it encapsulated everything about their relationship: teamwork, trust, understanding, and quiet courage. The widow smiled faintly at him, a small acknowledgement of their shared effort, and the rancher felt a warmth that went beyond mere appreciation. In the evenings, the widow began to speak more openly of her thoughts about survival, life, and the future. "Living is not just enduring," she told the rancher one night, as the sky turned orange and pink. "It is choosing to continue, to find meaning, to make life matter even after loss. That is why I am still alive, not because of luck, not because of fate, but because I chose to keep going, to find small reasons every day to hold on." The rancher listened quietly, understanding that her words were both a reflection of the past and a guide for the present. She shared more stories of resilience, recounting the moments when she had been completely alone, facing danger, hunger, and despair. Yet each story emphasized choice, courage, and the refusal to surrender. She spoke of listening to the land, observing the wind and the weather, and finding hidden resources in unexpected places. Every memory carried a lesson, every challenge a reason for strength. The rancher realized that her survival was not merely about endurance. It was about intelligence, patience, and an unyielding will to continue living, no matter the obstacles. There were also moments when the widow reflected on the power of human connection. She explained that while survival often required solitude and caution, the presence of someone trustworthy could transform life in subtle but profound ways. She had learned to open herself only when it felt safe, only when she recognized sincerity and patience. With the rancher, she felt such a presence. She trusted him not blindly, but because he had proven himself consistent, respectful, and understanding over time. This trust, though quiet, was a rare and meaningful gift. Their bond was further strengthened through the simple rhythm of daily life. They worked together in the fields, repaired fences, and prepared for the coming seasons. They shared meals, sometimes quietly, sometimes in conversation that flowed easily now, with no pressure, no judgment. The widow's home, once a place of solitude, had begun to feel alive in a new way. It was not that she depended on the rancher, but that his presence added warmth and balance to her carefully structured life. He respected her autonomy, and she welcomed his companionship. One evening, as the sky darkened and stars began to appear, the widow spoke of her past in a way that felt different from before. She described not the pain, but the lessons she had learned, the ways she had grown stronger, and the reasons she had survived. "Every scar, every hardship, every moment I thought I would not make it, those things taught me to value life, to choose strength, and to never give up," she said. "They are the reasons I am still standing, still breathing, still alive." The rancher listened with quiet admiration, understanding the courage it took to articulate such truths. Through these conversations, the rancher came to understand that survival was more than physical endurance. It was emotional, mental, and spiritual. The widow's life had been shaped by hardship, but she had forged meaning, resilience, and wisdom from each challenge. He realized that her strength was not simply in facing danger, but in choosing every day to continue living fully, with awareness and purpose. Her survival was deliberate, intentional, and remarkable. The frontier, with all its harshness, became a backdrop for their quiet journey together. While the wind could be unforgiving and the sun relentless, there was a shared rhythm in their lives. They relied on each other in ways both subtle and essential, from tending crops to mending fences, from caring for animals to sharing quiet moments under the open sky. Each day reinforced the lessons of patience, trust, and understanding that had grown between them. Over time, the widow also reflected on the emotional freedom she had found in their connection. She no longer carried the same fear of being completely alone, for she recognized the rancher's presence as steady and sincere. This realization did not erase the past or its scars, but it allowed her to acknowledge the possibility of life beyond survival, life that included companionship, trust, and shared strength. She had endured, and now she could also choose to engage fully with the present. There were small moments of joy that punctuated their days. Watching a sunrise, seeing a new plant sprout in the garden, tending to animals, or simply sitting together in quiet reflection. All of these became celebrations of life itself. The widow recognized that happiness did not need to be loud or extravagant. It could be found in small, deliberate acts, in quiet acknowledgement of beauty and connection. The rancher, too, learned this lesson, finding contentment in shared effort and mutual respect. Their connection culminated in the widow's ultimate recognition of her own strength and the meaning of her survival. One evening, she stood on the porch, looking over the wide plains and reflected aloud. "I have lived through more than most could bear," she said. "I have endured loss, danger, and solitude, and yet here I am. I am still alive because I chose to be. I am still standing because I refuse to give in. And I am here because I learned that life, even with its challenges, is worth living fully." The rancher stood beside her, silent but attentive, honoring the power and courage in her words. By this point, their bond was no longer tentative. It had become a steady, reliable presence in both of their lives. The widow had learned that trust and companionship could exist without compromising her autonomy, and the rancher had learned the depth of patience, respect, and understanding required to earn such trust. Together, they had created a life that was resilient, meaningful, and quietly powerful, rooted in mutual acknowledgement of strength and endurance. The seasons continued their cycle, and life on the frontier moved forward as always. Yet in the midst of this vast, often unforgiving landscape, the widow had discovered a sense of belonging and stability. Her survival was no longer just a matter of enduring hardships. It was about embracing life, choosing purpose, and finding connection. She had faced the past, acknowledged it, and transformed it into a source of wisdom and strength. In the final moments of this chapter of life, the widow and the rancher shared a quiet evening under the stars. The wind whispered through the grass and the night sky stretched endlessly above them. They spoke little, for words were not necessary. Their connection was already clear. The widow had survived unimaginable hardships and had emerged with strength, wisdom, and dignity. The rancher had witnessed it all, offering respect, presence, and understanding. Together, they had created a bond that was unspoken, enduring, and deeply human. Life continued with its challenges and beauty, its small joys and its persistent demands. But the widow faced it with the confidence of someone who had survived everything life had thrown at her and chosen to continue living fully. She was alive not by chance, not by luck, but because she had deliberately, courageously, and steadfastly refused to surrender. And in that refusal, she found meaning, companionship, and the quiet power of knowing that every day she lived was a testament to resilience, courage, and the strength of the human spirit. In the end, the Apache widow had not only survived, she had thrived. Her life, shaped by hardship and tempered by endurance, became a story of quiet strength and profound humanity. The rancher, having walked beside her through this journey, had witnessed the extraordinary resilience of a woman who had faced the impossible and chosen life, connection, and dignity. And in this quiet frontier, among the fields, animals, and endless sky, their story reached its full meaning. A life lived fully, courageously, and with unwavering strength.